Session 10-1, titled Perspective of UN Engagement Policy for the Peace and Korean Peninsula of KGFP 2021. My name is Lee Eun-jung, professor at Freie Universitaet, Berlin. KDI, School of Public Policy and Management, and Institute of Korean Studies at Freie Universitaet Berlin have organized this session 10-1. This is the second session co-organized by the two organizations following yesterday's session. Today we will focus our discussions on perspective of UN engagement policy for the peace on Korean Peninsula, what the UN can do to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula. Before we begin the session, allow me to briefly talk about what the two co-organizers have been conducting so far. The two organizations from 2020 have co-launched the Korea Studies Institute. So in Europe, we have invited and we are nurturing experts on Korea. And this is part of the public policy of the Korean government. In that sense, we are nurturing future talents who can become experts in Korean policies and who can work in Europe. In that sense, today's session is quite important because we have with us Center Fellow Teresa as well as Professor Kang and they are the rising stars for the future, and they will be presenting today. And also we have with us Professor Chun Hong-taek from KDI, and myself. We are the older generation, we are the oldies, and we have the newbies who will be leading future generation. So these people will lead future policies of the two countries, and they will actually become the leading experts of Korean policies in the future. But the session 10-1 is titled Perspective of UN Engagement Policy for the Peace on the Korean Peninsula. Now we have to look at the role of the UN, especially about UN sanctions to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula. And IAEA last week released a report that Yongbyon restarted its operations. And as a result, the UN as well as other international organizations are again talking about another level of UN sanctions to North Korea. Now, we need to bring a peace regime, but is the UN doing its best to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula? Let us find out with this session. We have 90 minutes for the session. We will hear two presentations and two discussions. I would like to give enough time for the presenters and the discussants. So I will give 20 minutes each for the presenters. Please limit your presentations within 20 minutes. And for the discussants, you will each have 10 minutes. Now, first, Dr. Kang and Dr. Teresa will present. Allow me to introduce Dr. Kang Ho-jae first. So he is now teaching about North Korea at Freie Universitaet Berlin, and he joined our institute this year in 2021, in April to be more exact. And since then, he has been conducting research on North Korea. So he is a novice researcher. Now the floor is yours, Dr. Kang.
방금 소개받은 강호재입니다. 반갑습니다.
As was introduced, I am Ho-jae Kang. It's a pleasure to meet you. So the COVID situation has aggravated, and that is why I am the only one here. And I know that many people are participating online, and we do not have participants here. And I want to now give my presentation. Today I'm going to be talking about the critique of sanctions-driven UN activities and proposals to strengthen its engagement and entanglement policy. And I want to criticize to a certain extent United Nations activities because I believe that it is imbalanced and that they are maintaining a stance that is not that relevant at the current stage. And so I want to point out those facts and then suggest a new direction. And there were 12 resolutions. And so I summarize it in a table. It was the first one, came out in 1993 during the first nuclear crisis, and it was due to the NPT, walking away of the NPT treaty. And then at the United Nations, the North Korean nuke issue started to be discussed at the United Nations level. And during that time, there were a missile tests from 2006. And then since then, 11 resolutions were adopted, and the last one was passed in 2017. And since then, we do not have any additional resolutions. And if we look at the purpose and the timing of the resolutions, it was all related to nuke tests. And when there were 6 nuke tests, resolutions were adopted and the resolutions were strengthened as they went on. And there was also a testing on the launchers for the missiles of the... So in 1993, there was the first resolution, and it was a missile development, and there was the Kwangmyeong-2. It was for a satellite launcher, and then that led to a different resolution. So that's the one that's a bit different. And then it was an there was an ICBM from North Korea, and it was 10,000 kilometers that was covered in the range, and it was Hwasong 14. And then since then there were many resolutions that came out back to back, and then there was the Hwasong 15. So it was a multi-warhead test, and that was a success. And then that led to the very last resolution. So looking at this structure, the United Nations, when they adopted a resolution, they were trying to stop the developments of nuclear weapons by North Korea. So it is directly related to nuclear weapons, and they wanted to block materials to develop such weapons from the outside world to enter North Korea. But the sanctions became more general economic sanctions, and later on it even banned maritime goods to be traded, and the reasoning behind that was to block funding into North Korea. And later on, so for DPRK, later on they even blocked the exports from DPRK to the outside world. They blocked the importing of goods and then exporting of goods, so both directions were blocked. Therefore, the sanctions were being strengthened, and what is even stronger than that is the content, not just the quantity. There was a special committee established for the sanction implementation, and then there was an expert panel that was established. So the expert panel, the naming itself is not that appropriate for what they were doing. It was an organization that overlooks the implementation of the sanctions. So at the United Nations, there were responses from the United Nations, which led to 11 resolutions being passed, and the direction and the scope of the sanctions was expanded. And they had a special panel, the expert panel, to implement and ensure the sanction. So this was the sanction activities adopted by the United Nations. So the actions were taken and they were quite strong. And looking at the resolution, it doesn't seem that they wanted to overcome the situation just through forces. They also tried to resolve the issue through diplomatic means. And the expert panel, it's included in the expert panel discussions. So there were efforts, and it was mentioned always in parallel that peaceful measures have to be taken. So in terms of the content, there were resolutions and sanctions to prevent and block DPRK's actions, but there were also on the same standing measures about peaceful actions. However, it was asymmetrically implemented. One side was implemented very strongly, but the other side was only in rhetoric. So it is connected with the conclusion of what I want to say, that there is an imbalance, asymmetric type of sanction and resolution. And then in 2017, in 2017 November, they completed their nuclear weapons. So the actions before 2017 November, they tried to prevent North Korea. And after North Korea developed and completed its nuclear weapons, then there should be a change in the policy, but it doesn't seem that the policies have changed. So the United Nations response to DPRK's nuclear weapons was too much focused on sanctions, and the purpose of the sanctions did not prepare for after DPRK completely developing its weapons. To go into the details, a sanction is about blocking imports and exports. It is in order to block the importation of materials to develop the nuclear weapons, because the raw materials to develop nuclear weapons did not exist in North Korea. So if you can block the movement of such material, then you can prevent development. And that was clear. But so they decided in the later phase to carry out indirect blockage. The first stage did not work, so they heightened the measures. Such indirect blockage of funding that may enter into nuclear weapons development was blocked. However, that led to side effects such as blockage of humanitarian aid that would have gone to children and women. In order to make changes to this, there were suggestions that the sanctions need to be changed, in particular when the weapons are completely developed. So we hear about flexibility in operating the sanctions. And there are some vulnerabilities to the sanctions. So they blocked importation, but they could not block informal types of goods going in. There was smuggling, and there was also self-development that occurred within DPRK. And second, during the development phase, this will work. But once the nuclear weapons have been developed and it is completed, for the completely developed nuclear weapons, this would not be an appropriate sanction and measure. And from 2018, for the past 4 years, since DPRK completely developed its nuclear weapons, we have not been able to respond. And during the development, and even after the completion of the development, DPRK, without cooperation from their side, other than coercive measures, there is nothing that we can do. So we need cooperation in order for them to neutralize their DPRK weapons. And imposing sanctions, it cannot be a logic to encourage cooperation from DPRK, so that is another issue. So this is an analogy. It's quite simple, so I'll try to go quickly. Let's say completion of nuclear weapons development is entering a university by passing a test. Sanctions is preventing the student from receiving any tutoring. So sanctions, it's interfering with the student trying to study. But once the student has passed the test and entered into university, then all we can do is eliminate the knowledge that that student has. So you have to go in and take out everything, but this is not possible. Therefore, we need a new alternative because North Korea has developed and completed their nuclear weapons development. And if we go into the content of the resolution, the resolutions are related to the nuclear weapon development attempts. And it didn't work, so it started to use indirect measures and it had side effects and sanctions were strengthened. They even had an expert panel and a sanctions committee. However, the peaceful negotiations and the discussions were just written down in word, but there aren't any organizations or methods to implement this. So both were pursued, but in terms of organization, it is asymmetric. So from the implementation, the sanction side, there's expert panel, and the expert panel seems to be excessively active, and that is being pointed out by many from the external world. The reports and the activities of the expert panel, there are many parts that we cannot agree with. There are some that are logically founded, but there are some parts that seem to be extreme. In the resolutions, the wording talks both about sanctions and peaceful negotiations and means, but in the implementation, it's not done this way. In addition, the expert panel, although the name says it's an expert, they aren't experts. It's just people who are related to the administration, and Japan is included in the expert panel. For Koreans, this may be a sensitive issue. However, it does not seem to have arisen to be a sensitive issue. And the expert panel, they would connect items that's found on the internet, and according to the report, we can see that they are not nuclear experts, and I don't know if these expert reports are based on expertise on the nuclear weapons, and so there's a lot of criticism on that part. So changes need to be made. And looking at the details, we can see why this happened in terms of the process. There were efforts made to adopt the resolution, but once the resolution is passed, then the clear purpose is no longer valid, and there are some issues that it even infringes on sovereignty of DPRK, and even items that are not related to weapons, it's included in the items that should be sanctioned. So in order to prevent development of nuclear weapons, sanctions were imposed, but the sanctions did not work. It failed, and DPRK developed its nuclear weapons. Then we need to be critical about this and find an alternative. So after the completion of nuclear development in DPRK, we need another policy. So that is the reason behind needing to change policy. And there are strong concerns that with the heightened sanctions, DPRK isolation becomes stronger. If DPRK breaks away from its isolation, surrendering to the international society, that will be fine. But if they do not do that, then they may feel that external disputes do not have an influence on their internal situation. Then they will do what they want. And if they feel disappointed in diplomatic efforts, they will focus on self-reliance and self-sufficiency. And that is why North Korea currently is pursuing agriculture. The isolation that was imposed from the outside is now being strengthened internally within DPRK. They may think that that's the only way out. So the sanctions have not worked in preventing a development of nuclear weapons, and yet it is adding to the isolation, which leads to a heightened risk of conflict. And so the sanctions did not prevent development of nuclear weapons, yet it is aggravating the risk of conflict. That is another reason why we need to shift gears. So it is time for us to have cooperation. Cooperation is a positive one, but sanctions is a negative. You can't do this, you can't do that. Therefore, cooperation and sanctions cannot go together. And at this point, I think we need to rethink sanctions. So instead of strengthening isolation of DPRK, we need to have a positive policy of engagement, or even to go so far as entanglement. The works that the United Nations has to do is that the nuclear weapons of North Korea, it has to be scientifically reviewed and verified. From the outside, just trying to think about what the situation in North Korea is not enough. We need more scientific reviews and evaluations. At Yeonbyeon in DPRK, many people feel that there are signs that DPRK has nuclear activities there, but it is all just speculation. We need more data-based analysis, such as number of warheads, and you need to, if you look at the reports that are out, it's different. It differs greatly. So the scientific basis is not strong. And I have been saying this continuously, that the United Nations engagement could not be implemented because they did not have an organization to implement this. We need to manage nuclear weapons of North Korea and the dispute situation by managing the situation through an organization. And in order to encourage cooperation from DPRK and for us to work with DPRK in controlling and managing their nukes, then we need to know DPRK's thinking. The production, usage, and proliferation, we should make sure they're not doing that and encouraging them to maintain such stoppage of production and so forth. And North Korea, they want to it doesn't seem that they want to hold on and maintain DPRK. They feel that too much resources and experts and resources have been overly focused on nuclear weapons. So in the DPRK's policy, it's been more than 10 years since they have stated that they want to move away on this overly focused policy on nuclear weapons. So on the United Nations levels, it's an asymmetric situation. So we should strengthen the engagement and entanglement, and we should take advantage of DPRK so that they can cooperate with us. And so that's the end of my present. To go on to the conclusion, in the resolutions there are comments about peaceful resolution, but in the implementation and in the alternative, peaceful negotiations just exist in words, whereas for the sanctions they have organizations for implementation. Therefore there has to be self-reflection of this, and since the sanctions could not prevent development of nuclear weapons, we should realize that these sanctions were a failure, and if sanctions continue on, we must face the reality that it doesn't work anymore. So what is already written in the resolutions should now be implemented, which is engagement and entanglement, in order to enable cooperation from North Korea, and North Korea's nuclear weapons can be managed together with North Korea. So right now, due to sanctions, military tensions are escalating. Therefore, we need to seriously consider this situation, and that is an argument that I would like to make. DPRK, they have nuke weapons, but in wording or writing or in their verbal comments, they do not say they want to use this to act others. They want to, they have doctrines, they have economic pursuits, and if we utilize this, we can have a rational management of North Korea's nuclear weapons. Thank you. Dr. Kang, thank you very much. You talked about United Nations sanction policies in order to denuclearize North Korea. They are sanctions, but in the resolution, they talk about cooperation and peaceful negotiation. However, there is an imbalance in the two, and if this is ultimately for global peace, then it should not be a unilateral policy of sanctions. There should be a cooperation and momentum for dialogue, and that can be through entanglement. Entanglement, according to Dr. Kang, is a type of entanglement found in European Union, because once you are engaged in dialogue, you cannot go to war at the same time. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Now moving on to the next presenter, Dr. Teresa Novotná will give us a European perspective. And now allow me to introduce Dr. Novotná. She is currently a Korea Europe Center Fellow at Freie Universitaet Berlin, but she was actually held a Marie Curie research project on the EU's foreign policy towards North Korea. And she was also a visiting professor at SNU. She received her doctorate from Boston University in 2012, and also other degrees from Charles University, Prague. And she also served in various organizations, and she cooperates of the Europe Center right now. So she is a fellow, as I mentioned, of Korea Europe Center. Now the floor is yours, Dr. Teresa.
Yes, hello everyone. 안녕하세요. It's wonderful to be here again on another panel, and thank you very much for a very nice introduction. I think it's especially nice to be here at the KGFP for academics, because this is a 1.5 track discussion with policymakers, and it's always good that academics and practitioners can share their perspectives and enrich each other. And also, I think this panel is a nice example of Korea-Europe collaboration, and I really hope there will be more of it. I will start sharing my presentation, so just bear with me a few seconds before I switch to the screen sharing. Yeah, so I hope now everyone can see it. So I will be talking about engagement, as Dr. Kang was sort of so nicely advocating for, but engagement during the Cold War. So I will be making more of a historical case, and then I will draw some lessons for the current situation. Professor Lee very nicely introduced myself. So you can see that I work normally more on current issues, more on Korea's, in terms of Europe's role on the Korean Peninsula, and also, how this all now fits with the new Biden administration and U.S.-China rivalry. So going back to history is quite a new exercise for myself as well. You can also have a look at some of the publications that I've done recently. I also would like to say that I am not a historian, but I still believe in the statement that Mark Twain once supposedly said, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And it is therefore quite useful to look at some historical experiences. So what can history tell us about the future? Well, as Dr. Kang so nicely presented, when it comes to the DPRK and international community, especially at the UN level, there's kind of a consensus that we need more pressure, that we need more sanctions. But if we look in the past, even at the height of the Cold War, there have been multilateral negotiations going on, and so therefore it's good to have a look how it worked in the past. So it's useful to distill broader and applicable lessons, but of course always to be mindful of a different context, and we can sort of mix and match various tools. Because of that, I've chosen two case studies to look at. One is the so-called Helsinki Process, and the other one is the German or West German Ostpolitik or Eastern politics. So why these two specific case studies? As I just said, even during the sort of the highest tensions during the Cold War, there have been negotiations going on. There have been negotiations going on at a multilateral level, so that's the Helsinki Process, but also at the bilateral sort of Germany to Germany, so to speak, level. That would be the Ostpolitik, the Eastern politics. The second reason why I chose these two cases is that usually people, when they think about Germany and Germany's example for the Korean Peninsula, they often look at the unification experience. So in a way, everything would happen after 1989. Yet for the current situation, maybe the period from, let's say, the late 60s until 1989 would be a little bit more relevant. And also, people tend to look at the German experience much more than at the experience of the other countries of the Soviet bloc in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, myself, I'm Czech, so of course, for me personally, the experience from the other parts of the Soviet bloc is more relevant. But no comparison is perfect, and in a sense, we shouldn't think about these two case studies as kind of models for the Korean Peninsula to emulate. You should think about it more as sort of ideal times, and if South Korean or even North Korean governments choose to use some of the tools, they can sort of see what would be convenient for them at this stage, but not to sort of say, one is a perfect model for the other. but yet, to some extent, the Helsinki process would be sort of an example of how the denuclearization negotiations could go, while the Ostpolitik is more relevant for the inter-Korean relations. So I'll now talk a little bit about the Helsinki process, or I should first say Helsinki talks, that took place between 1972 and 1975. So you see on the map the countries which are in red, which would be part of at the time of the Soviet bloc. Well, what were the goals? From the Soviet side, the goals were to basically get recognition of this sphere of influence of the borders. That was the main reason why the Soviet Union even initiated these discussions. And then later on, sort of the economic side of things came into place. But the first incentive was to basically recognize the borders and establish some security guarantees for the Soviet Union. On the Western side, the recognition of borders was something the West didn't want, but was interested still in preserving its own security, and of course was interested in helping with sort of humanitarian needs or to the population of the Soviet bloc. The Helsinki process did not include specific military talks, so the disarmament talks and discussions about nuclear negotiations were left aside, although they were going on at the same time. Here we see pictures of the main actors signing the so-called final accord or final act in the 1975. We see here mainly the American and Soviet side, but important point about the Helsinki process is that it was a very large process. It included 35 countries. So you can see here on the charts that especially the Western bloc was quite multiple, so to speak. But it included not only NATO countries led by the United States, but it also included sort of neutral or non-aligned countries in Europe, such as Switzerland or even Finland as the organizer, and also various, we would say, small or almost politically irrelevant countries. Such as Monaco, and I hope I'm not offending anyone who comes from Monaco or San Marino. But you see that the membership was quite diverse. The agreements were separated into so-called three baskets. The first one was focused on security. It included various confidence-building measures, for instance, a notification of and observation of troop maneuvers around Europe. So basically preventing some kind of misunderstanding in terms of troop movements on the European continent. The second basket included all sorts of economic and trade mechanisms, as well as environmental and scientific cooperation. And the third basket, which was at the end the most important one, but initially sort of added under the Western pressure that related to human rights, free flow of information, but also cultural and educational exchanges. And then we can say there was a fourth basket, which was sort of procedural, but the first three are the most important ones. So the Helsinki process as such, it's actually the period more after signing the final act rather than before. That would, in theory, last until 1989, or someone could say until the 90s, when the Organization for Security and Cooperation has been established. And I said that also it kind of went in parallel with some meetings related to specific military aspects which took then place in Belgrade, Vienna, Madrid, and other places. But it was definitely a forum for dialogue to discuss other issues after signing the accords in the 70s. And as I said, the third basket basically proved the most important because this is where the opposition in Central and Eastern Europe, especially in Czechoslovakia, took its clues and sort of insisted that the Soviet Union signed agreement where human rights are a part of the agreement, and therefore Soviet Union and all the Soviet bloc governments should adhere to the human rights. So now to see what are the differences between then and now. Well, big difference is already in the sort of the initial stage, where the impetus for the talks came from the Soviet side, because the Soviet Union wanted the recognition of the borders. So obviously there's quite a lot of doubts whether the DPRK at the moment would actually initiate such international negotiations. To some extent, the negotiations were short. They took only 2 years, but then the implementation from the 70s until late 80s took quite a long time. Based on other experiences, such as Iran nuclear negotiations, my expectation would be that if there are any negotiations with the DPRK, there would be much longer negotiations and possibly even longer implementation. So the length of the talks and implementation would probably be nowadays quite different. I don't expect that we will have 35 parties negotiating with the DPRK, but nevertheless, there may be more than 2, meaning DPRK and the United States. Of course, at that time, Soviet Union and United States and the two blocs were of different size and of different economic strengths than is the current situation. There was quite an interesting role of civil society, not just the one I mentioned, but also in the West. And there was quite a specific constellation of leaders who sort of pushed through the negotiations. On the American side was American President Gerald Ford, who was quite harshly criticized for signing the accords and for going forward with them. And he was criticized also by the left in the United States, not just by his fellow Republicans. But at the same time, once Jimmy Carter became the next president of the United States, he actually followed through and he continued in pursuing the Helsinki process. So there is, quite a strong need for, especially on the U.S. side, to have presidents who would stick to the agreement. But I think there are things which could be useful for the Korean Peninsula. That is the multilateralization of the process, the de-escalation and confidence-building measures, the economic and scientific and people-to-people cooperation, the longevity of the process, meaning that it did survive more than just one American president, and to some extent Europe as the convener. On the negative side of things, well, the Helsinki was just a political agreement. It wasn't actually legally binding, so to some extent anyone could have broken the agreement without any punishment. The nuclear negotiations and the military negotiations were sort of going on the side. And as I said, the opposition within the Soviet bloc got strengthened throughout the process. So obviously this would be kind of, sort of a disincentive for the DPRK to participate in any similar exercise. And as I mentioned, there's issues of who initiated the process and who led the process further. And I'm not too sure if either the DPRK or even the Biden administration would sort of follow in the footsteps. But there's also a question for the South Korean side, and that would be the question of the recognition of the borders and recognition of the other side, that is the DPRK officially. And that brings me to sort of more lessons from the Ostpolitik. And I can see that I don't have much time, so I'll try to speed up a little bit. Which was a policy in West Germany after sort of diplomatic isolation and non-recognition of the East Germany, led mainly by Willy Brandt, who was a social democratic West German chancellor. And the idea was to sort of create a change within East Germany through engagement, through rapprochement. But the Ostpolitik to some extent survived not just the social democratic chancellors, but lasted until 1989, when in the 80s the government was led by a conservative Chancellor Kohl. And as I said, it was to some extent accompanied by a broader engagement between the Soviet bloc and the United States through the Helsinki Process, but also through other bilateral agreements between West Germany and Eastern Bloc. So the Ostpolitik led to the so-called Basic Treaty, Grundlagenvertrag, from 1972, which, in contrast to the Helsinki Accords, is a legally binding treaty. It led to a mutual recognition of the GDR and West Germany. It led to mutual recognition of the borders and also to recognition of the GDR by states like the United States, Australia, UK, France, and others. And it led to sort of de facto exchange of ambassadors, although the representations have never been called embassies, but permanent representations. And as a result, also both Germanies joined the UN. So I know at the beginning there were a few panels at this conference sort of thinking about the agreement on reconciliation, non-aggression, exchange and cooperation from 1991 between South and North Korea. So there are some parallels, but the parallels are not perfect ones, especially when it comes to the diplomatic recognition and the right to unify the Korean Peninsula. You can see that the term permanent representation has been used not only for restaurants in Germany, in Berlin, but also nowadays the members of the European Union, when they have their embassies accredited to the European Union, they are actually called permanent representations. The Ostpolitik led to also other treaties or other agreements on cooperation between West and East Germany. They related to health, communication, motorways, railways, veterinary areas, cultural cooperation. So those were treaties from the 70s until 80s. also, it led to the first visit by an East German leader to West Germany in 1987. So Erich Honecker visited Helmut Kohl at the year. And what I find really most interesting, which is not a specific result of the Ostpolitik, but it is an inspiration, is the so-called Freie. So basically the fact that the West German government would sort of buy off East Germans who were either imprisoned or towards the end they just really wanted to leave East Germany and to resettle to West Germany. So the West German government would actually pay East German government to let these people go. And in the 70s, there were at the beginning only about 3,000 people like this, but in the late 80s, you already had around 20,000 people being sold from the east to the west. And plus, there was a special arrangement that East Germany would allow pensioners to resettle, East German pensioners to resettle to the west if they wanted to, because basically it would alleviate burden to pay for the pensioners. So just to quickly wrap up, when it comes to the differences, I think in a way the Helsinki Process and Ostpolitik are somehow tied to each other. So it's a bit like inter-Korean process being tied to US DPRK talks. There was conducive domestic political situation in West Germany where even the conservatives sort of continued the progressive policies, and I'm not too sure whether this would be the case in South Korea. And at the time, diplomacy as such wasn't seen as a reward for good behavior as it is sometimes seen now. And of course, there are some internal German differences. So you see here a picture from the beginning, from signing the contracts and the visit of the East German leader to the West. And my last slide saying what could be useful for the Korean Peninsula nowadays. I think especially more creativity with the diplomacy and with this mutual recognition with the DPRK could be useful. Perhaps something like the Freikauf. I don't think it has ever been tried or even suggested by South Korean government to sort of buy off North Korean citizens. And I think the big lesson is to be patient. All these negotiations really take time. But at the same time, they are possible even if you are at the height of a Cold War, even if you are at the height of big tension. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Doctor, for the presentation. So you talked about the height of the Cold War and what the EU and Germany experienced, the dialogue and the cooperative tools that they relied on at the time. And we can learn from that to maybe break through the stalemate on the Korean Peninsula. So both Korea and the international community can learn from that. We need diplomacy, we need patience, but at the same time, if there are other tools that you can make use of, let us be open and stay creative to identify those tools. And Dr. Kang, you also talked about creativity that it has to be entangled, and we need to stay creative to explore more options. And I think that Helsinki process can serve as a good model for us to entangle. So as Dr. Novotna mentioned, I know that we cannot adopt everything from Germany's case, but we can be flexible and take a flexible approach in selectively learning from Germany's case. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now, moving on to the discussion, we have also some audience with us on YouTube, and I would like to ask the audience to ask questions on YouTube as well. You can use the QR code to leave your questions, so please be reminded that you can ask questions. But before that, I would like to ask Professor Chun Hong-taek for his discussion. And Professor Chun Hong-taek is Emeritus Professor at KGI School of Public Policy and Management, and he's an expert in North Korea's economy. So from 1990s, he has been serving in KGI, and he's been researching in North Korea's economy. And in Korea, he devotes his research in North Korea's economy. So he is one of the most prestigious scholars in this field. He has released many papers, and he also serves as advisor to many different organizations across Korea. So I would like to ask Professor Chun for his discussion. Now the floor is yours. Yes, hello. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss about two great presentations. I was very happy to hear the two great presentations. Yes, I majored in political economy, and so the development and development cooperation are some of the fields that I'm very much interested in. So I may not be the right person to talk about security, but I first ask for your understanding first. Thank you very much, Dr. Novotna, for the presentation, and thank you very much, Dr. Kang, for your very interesting presentation. So, Dr. Novotna, you talked about the Cold War, and even at the height of the Cold War, Europe saw engagement, not only conflict. Korea is quite interested in Ostpolitik, but we should move beyond that policy and have a broader perspective to learn lessons from the Helsinki process as well. You talked about the socialist under USSR, and you also talked about the Western Bloc under the US. So there was this conflict between the two blocs, but at the same time, they also negotiated. So that worked until 1989 to resolve many issues. And I think that the two Koreas can learn from such example. So your presentation was quite impressive in that sense. You also talked about Ostpolitik and the Helsinki process and how these two can teach us many lessons. Of course, we cannot apply everything from Ostpolitik and the Helsinki process, but still we have much to learn from those two cases. So thank you very much for your advice. Now, about Professor Kang.
Dr. Kang talked about the United Nations sanctions against DPRK nuclear activities, and he provided us with an analysis of that situation. And he stated that UN activities were overly focused on sanctions and less on engagement, that there's room for improvement in engagement with North Korea. And so both of the presentations were very impressive.
And also you talked about Helsinki Process, Dr. Novotna, and Ostpolitik, and Korea is quite interested in those two cases, especially Notteu administration back in 1980s and 1990s. There was this northern policy adopted by Notteu, the former president, and he followed the model of Ostpolitik and the sunshine policy of Kim Dae-jung, which continued on to Roh Moo-hyun administration, also learned and also emulated the Ostpolitik model. In fact, the late President Kim Dae-jung said that his sunshine policy and West Germany's Ostpolitik are quite closely related. He wrote in detail about the similarities between the two. And I think, Dr. Novotna, you also raised some questions about the next step. What about Korea? If will the Conservative Party willing to change its mindset? Well, under Notteu administration, that was a Conservative party, and Roh Moo-hyun and Kim Dae-jung, they were progressive. But still, they emulated the model of Ostpolitik. Of course, it was changed slightly later on. But when we think about it, maybe it has to do with the other counterpart as well. What I mean by that is there was this basic treaty between the West and East Germany, which was well conformed with by the nations. However, the basic treatment between the two Koreas back in 1991 and the denuclearization joint statement that was signed between the two Koreas, well, they fell apart only a few years later. And the main reason behind that is because North Korea thought that following Ostpolitik will only benefit North Korea. And North Korea thought that the sunshine policy is to break our regime apart. That was the perception of North Korea. So given the secret speeches given by Chairman Kim of North Korea, they talk about Ostpolitik and say that this is not the path that we should embark on. So when it comes to a Helsinki process, it's not just South Korea that is shy to adopt and learn from Ostpolitik, but North Korea was also a little bit reluctant to apply Ostpolitik fully. And the US also focused on economic growth. The same went with, well, if you look at the case of Vietnam, then maybe we can open avenues for engagement by focusing on initiatives such as economic cooperation.
And Professor Kang, in his first presentation, mentioned something quite interesting. He provided an interesting analysis, and Professor Kang said that the Security Council took measures against DPRK, and he pointed out two problems, and that because of these two problems, as the United Nations Security Council moves forward, it will have to choose different alternatives. That the UNSC had neglected dialogue and peace processes and was overly focused on sanctions. Thus, there needs to be a rebalancing. And the second problem pointed out was that the purpose of sanctions was to prevent nuclear weapons development. But DPRK has already completed its development, so the sanctions have failed. And in order to deal with the DPRK nuclear weapons, we need the cooperation from DPRK, yet sanctions are negative policies, and this cannot go hand in hand with cooperation, which is in the positive. Thus, he stated that because of these two problems, the conclusion that we can draw is that instead of sanctions, we need to strengthen engagement that can encourage cooperation from North Korea. And that was his conclusion. First of all, we were not able to resume nuclear talks with DPRK negotiations, and we need to break away from such a stalemate. However, and I do agree on this point with Dr. Kang, and the new approach and the new direction will have to be different from the past, and it should encourage engagement from DPRK. However, what Dr. Kang criticized, the 2 points that you mentioned, I think it is because you do not have a correct interpretation of Security Council mechanism and the dialogue and the sanctions mechanism. So the conclusion itself, I do agree fully, but on the logic that led to the conclusion, I am not so in agreement with that. The purpose of sanctions is not just to block development of nuclear weapons. It is a method or tool to induce the country to come to the negotiating table for dialogue, and that is the biggest negotiating card, those sanctions. And so once North Korea comes out for negotiations, the negotiations will not be led by UN Security Council. It will be a country that has the biggest interest that represents the countries that impose the sanctions. And there will be strategies and decisions that are made during the negotiation process. So the United Nations Security Council expert panel, something similar to that, and other organizations and committees, they're larger in size, and the UN organization is quite large. And so it's not easy for them to tackle that. So this is not necessarily a United Nations Security Council issue. It is more related to the negotiation strategy of the United States. Maybe that would have been more logical of an approach. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for the great discussion. Professor John. So Dr. Kang and Dr. Novotna, I think that Professor John talked about some points that you can really ponder on and gave us some food for thought. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Eric Balbach. And he is an associate in the Asia Research Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And since 2015, he has been a postdoctoral research fellow and lecturer at the Institute of Korean Studies at the Freie Universitaet Berlin. And this international and security affairs is the only think tank in Berlin. It is the most prestigious think tank in Berlin and Germany. Now, without further ado, the floor is yours, Eric.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to react to those two very interesting presentations by my colleagues, Dr. Kang and Dr. Novot. I think we can identify two main threads, basically, which also link the two presentations. That is, and I want to briefly reply to them, that is sanctions on the one hand, and multilateralism, or the role of multilateralism on the other hand. These two issues, of course, are intrinsically linked to each other, and I just want to briefly react to those. Let me start with the second one, and with Dr. Novotna's presentation, which I found very interesting. And of course, we have discussed this many times, these implications of the experience of the European experiences, or the case of Korea in specific, or Northeast Asia or East Asia more generally. And I think we have to understand what multilateralism actually is and what it means and how it differentiates between European case and the East Asian case. I think in the case of Korea and East Asia more broadly, multilateralism is still best understood as kind of an extension and intersection of national power and purpose, rather than as an objective force in itself. So East Asian multilateralism, of course, is far less institutionalized than those in Europe. They involve a high degree of discreteness, informality, and consensus building. And that is not to say that one multilateralism is better than the other. It's just to acknowledge that it is very different in the European East Asian case. And as such, I think it is important to acknowledge that this is not an either-or option. It is not an either bilateralism or multilateralism decision. Because if we take a closer look at East Asian multilateralism, we see that also historically, every case of successful multilateral agreement that has had a very strict and very stable bilateral substructure beneath it. Let's just take the six-party talks as an example. Basically, every agreement in the six-party talks was first negotiated bilaterally among the six-party talk member states. So let's say the 2015 or the 2017 agreement, many of them, of course, have been previously negotiated bilaterally among, let's say, North Korea and the US, but also the US and China, North Korea and China. And then they were brought to the six-party talks table and then kind of multilateralized. So if we want to have a successful and stable multilateral structure, we need to, of course, simultaneously address the bilateral substructure of every successful multilateralism in the region. Of course, many of this also holds true for Europe. It's not, like I said, it's not to rate a more successful or less successful kind of multilateralism. It's just to acknowledge a very different structure in East Asia. And especially if we talk about the Korean case, we of course have to acknowledge that many bilateral relationships are still not very stable. If we only take the inter-Korean case, of course we have to acknowledge that the main task will be to strengthen the dyadic inter-Korean development dynamics before we can successfully multilateralize any inter-Korean or Korean Peninsula issue. And of course, this holds true for the other relationships as well. If we think about China-US conflict at the moment, which will of course then complicate further negotiations on Korean Peninsula, especially security issues. So I think this is the first point I want to make. We really have to understand what multilateralism is and how it works in each individual case. When it comes to the Helsinki Accord, there are, of course, many issues, many things we can learn, we can take to then further discuss its relevancy to the Korean or wider East Asian case. But I think we, of course, also have to acknowledge that the process itself was very different than anything which could materialize in the Korean case. Let's only take the small power versus the global power issue. If we talk about the Korean case and the North Korean denuclearization issue, we have a small power which basically is confronted with a number of larger and, of course, one global power. So this is a very different structure than compared to the Helsinki process. We have an under-institutionalized regional security architecture in which any, let's say, Northeast Asian Helsinki process would materialize. And of course, there is the elephant in the room. The Helsinki Accord, of course, was not geared toward denuclearization, even though security cooperation, security issues were also front and center. The Helsinki Accord and the Helsinki negotiations were not aimed at denuclearizing the US or the Soviet Union. So we have a very different set of issues here we have to confront. Regarding the first presentation by Kang, I think I can only agree with what Professor Thur also said right before my brief intervention here. I think sanctions are important. Knows that I'm a very skeptic. I'm a big skeptic when it comes to sanctions against North Korea, but only if we talk about sanctions as a strategy. Sanctions will never be a strategy in and of itself, and sanctions alone will not change North Korean behavior in the longer run. I'm very convinced of that, so I agree with much of what Dr. Kang has said, but I think we have to be very careful if we say that cooperation and sanction cannot exist together, because there are quite a few historical examples that basically show that it actually can. But of course, at the moment, we are in this very difficult situation that in our dealings with North Korea, we focus very much on sanctions and forget or dismiss the second part of it, namely the dialogue and cooperation part. So sanctions are important. The UN and, of course, also the EU sanctions moved away from what they are actually designed for. Namely, they were designed initially as targeted sanctions, meaning they were targeted against specific individuals, specific institutions in the PPRK, which were somehow involved in their WMD programs, in their weapons of mass destruction programs. And both the UN and the EU moved away from these targeted sanctions to what we can only describe as most comprehensive sanctions now, moving ever closer to a full embargo. And this, of course, can be criticized by pretty much all of us, I think, given the historical example we still have in mind from the full embargo against the Iraq in the 1990s, which basically was the starting point for moving away from embargoes to targeted sanctions. And with regard to North Korea, of course, we can very much discuss if what we see with regard to sanctions against North Korea are still targeted sanctions. I believe it is not. It is most comprehensive sanctions regime, which of course also then has a negative impact on civilians in North Korea. And this we can very well criticize, but I think the same with bilateralism versus multilateralism. we cannot choose or identify simply one issue and say we can either have sanctions or have dialogue. Many examples, of course, historical examples show that very much like Professor John also said, sometimes we need sanctions, unfortunately, to ensure that we can have dialogue in the longer run. So the challenge for the UN, of course, is then to balance humanitarian assistance, which is, of course, emphasized by the UN's own sub-organizations, with the pressure politics of the UN Security Council. So this, of course, is a challenge in and of itself. If history is any guide, I think sanctions alone will not change North Korea's behavior. Sanctions always have to be a part of a broader strategic approach to North Korea. We have to understand this duality also in the pain inflicted de facto by sanctions. We all know that Kim Jong-un himself has repeatedly, during the last 1.5 years, repeatedly acknowledged that sanctions did inflict pain on North Korea. On the other hand, we also have to acknowledge this duality. We have to also acknowledge the indisputable fact that North Korea did not stop its own nuclear weapons program, besides or despite the sanctions of the international community. And this duality we have to understand. If we want to pressure North Korea, if we want to inflict pain, we certainly did this with the latest rounds of 2017 sanctions against North Korea. But, and this is where I agree with Dr. Kang, those sanctions did not reverse the North Korea's decision to basically pursue nuclear weapons, its nuclear weapons program. And like Professor Yi said initially, we saw just in the last few days the resumptions of activities in Yongbyon, in the Yongbyon facilities. So North Korea did make a strategic decision here, and sanctions alone will certainly not change the North Korean strategic calculus in this regard. So while this is true, economic sanctions have been a central element of the international community strategy vis-à-vis North Korea since the end of the Cold War, especially, and I think it would be a little bit too much positive thinking that this will change in the short to mid-term. So we also, on the one hand, we have to deal with North Korea as it is, not as we wish it to be, but also we have to deal with the international community as it is and not as we wish it to be. And sanctions will be a part of the international community strategy in the foreseeable future. So we have to create spaces for dialogue despite sanctions still being reality of the international community's North Korea policy, and it will be in the foreseeable future. So these are my brief interventions, and I thank you very much again for the opportunity to participate in this panel and to meet all the old and new colleagues again. Thank you very much.
Eric, 감사합니다.
Yes, thank you very much for your commentary. You talked about cooperation other than sanctions, and that we need to take a two-track approach of sanctions and cooperation. And I think that you raised questions, both to Professor Kang and Novotná, and Professor Ton said that because of the case of Germany, Korea is having a harder time to decide the next step. Now, Professor Kang.
Teresa?
Excuse me, Dr. Novotná.
Can you answer that?
Dr. Novotná, can you provide the answers?
Yes. Thank you very much to both discussants with very relevant remarks, and I basically agree with both of you. So it's a bit difficult for me to say something different. Maybe just to comment a little bit more on some of the points. Of course, withdrawing lessons from anything which happened before 1989 is always quite difficult for the Korean Peninsula because we know how it ended. That is with the dismantlement of the Soviet bloc and Soviet Union and end of the communist regimes around Central and Eastern Europe. So to sell anything to North Korea, to emulate anything which has happened before 1989 is always going to be difficult because you will always have to sort of make the case why that policy is not going to lead to the dismantlement of the North Korean regime. Otherwise, why would DPRK cooperate? Nevertheless, I think there is a positive side or a silver lining to that, and that's the sort of period, quite a long period, 20 years or so of peaceful coexistence and de-escalation of tensions and building of mutual trust and cooperation in all other fields, as I mentioned. So that would be one aspect that could be sort of a bit more attractive to the DPRK side. From the other side of the things, I can't agree more with Eric that multilateralism it has to be the key and has to be sort of understood properly. What I find quite interesting from the Helsinki process is that it included all sorts of countries, not only the main actors, US and the Soviet Union, or possibly, let's say, the Soviet bloc countries and the key players in Western Europe, but also lots of these smaller states or independent or non-aligned states. And that was the sort of the way how the whole process has been anchored internationally. So that's, I think, quite a good argument for, say, for instance, Europe. Why should Europe be included as sort of an independent player or not directly involved player on the Korean Peninsula in any international discussions with the DPRK? And also, I think important point is that it was a dialogue during a Cold War. And nowadays, I sometimes have a feeling that even going to sit to a table or even to launch political dialogue with the DPRK is considered as something we shouldn't do because it will benefit the DPRK leadership. But on the other hand, if you look what diplomacy is there to do, it is to solve difficult situations. It is to discuss even if you are in a conflict. So I think this change of paradigm is quite necessary. And maybe last point on sort of more domestic politics, which actually relates more to Germany. And I find quite interesting that in the 70s, it was the Social Democrats which pushed first, so the progressives, let's say, for the dialogue with East Germany, so West German progressives, Social Democrats, with talks with East Germany. And yet, when we look at the social democratic policies in Germany towards the DPRK, the Social Democrats seem to be the most hardline party within the German political spectrum. So I hope that even the Germans will sort of learn from their own history and a little bit change their views. And there will be elections in late September, so let's see how this all goes here where I am in Berlin. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Novotna, for the answer. You talked about the SD party in Germany, that it has the hardline stance. Now, next, Dr. Kang.
두 분 박사님의
Thank you. for the advice and also the agreements. The two doctors understand the military tensions on the Korean Peninsula, and I felt that both of you felt that the situation right now is problematic, and we're trying to find ways to overcome the situation. And Dr. Chun, in his comments, there were slight differences in our interpretation, and you were quite short in your comments. So I don't think you were able to express all of your thoughts, but United Nations mechanism and the dialogue and sanction mechanisms, that it is a bit different from your understanding with mine. That seemed to be your point. And I looked at the resolutions and how the resolutions were being implemented. And in that part, when the various actions are taken, when there were nuclear tests, then there were resolutions that were adopted by the United Nations Security Council, and one method in that resolution were sanctions, and there were diplomatic methods that could be interpreted through the resolutions. And after that, of course, sanctions purpose is not just to have sanctions, it is to realize peace on the Korean Peninsula, and to have peace on the Korean Peninsula, we need to induce change from DPRK. But the connection between the two, and you said that we can bring North Korea to the negotiation table through sanction. Of course, there can be situations and phases in which that will happen, but sanctions are in response to nuclear weapons development. So another response to nuclear weapons development can be diplomatic methods. So if sanctions and the dialogues can go together, that would be what was recorded. That's the trend, using these two methods together, and that is shown in history. However, it's difficult for me to agree that sanctions are a means to induce dialogue. If you coerce someone to come to the negotiation table using a sanction, would the talks be considered genuine? Of course, there were cases where this was successful, but there were many failures. And regarding DPRK, up till now, it was not successful. Of course, it may be successful in the future, but in this process, there will be conflict and tensions. And is this something that we can bear and endure? As one who has to live in this situation, I want to prevent escalation of such conflicts and tensions. And so continuously carrying out sanctions and making this lead to dialogue. This instead of this, it's like when you are trying to raise your kids, and instead of trying to criticize them and scold them everything they do wrong, instead you can approach it in a way of encouraging them whenever you see them doing something right. So the stick it can be one way of raising a child, and praises can be the way of raising children. And according to many parents, it's experience that a stick and praising children do not lead to same results. Just because something did not exist in the past or in history doesn't mean that it cannot be an alternative. And the Korean Peninsula's history, and in confrontation with DPRK, and especially in confronting DPRK in its nuclear weapons development, we need to reflect on whether sanctions were successful or not, and I wanted to provide a reflection to this. The two is coexisting, and it's that we have to accept this reality. On this, I am concerned that if we just accept reality as is, then we might end up accepting a divided Korean Peninsula as is. So all of these discussions on the sanctions, it was appropriate before 2017 because they had not completed their nuclear weapons development, and it was rational. That might be right, but starting from November 29, 2017, they have developed their nuclear weapons, and they physically demonstrated that they now have nukes. Therefore, scientifically, we can criticize this, and so we are in a new phase, and we are in this new phase, which means DPRK has completed their nuclear weapons development. In this situation, there are limitations to sanctions. In the past, there were concerns about sanctions, yet we did not have a choice, but now we do have a choice. For example, there was a summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un, and it was in 2 rounds, and it was quite positive, and I know many people applauded the attempts. Of course, the result was not good. What then, is the method wrong because it failed? No, we can continuously try to go toward one another and come to a compromise and try to understand one another, going one step toward one another, and this is a praising. And I feel that sanctions are uncomfortable, not just for DPRK. It seems that we're trying to coerce DPRK into getting something, and so I have doubts about this method.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Kang, for the answer. Yes, in the long term, of course, our goal is reunification on the Korean Peninsula, and we have to work together to be aligned on the direction to take. We are past our time, so we will not be able to entertain questions from the audience, but I'll just wrap up the session. And as Professor Thur said, back in 1990s, Germany was unified, and we tried to learn from Germany and the case of Helsinki Process. South and North Korea are in fact looking and examining our current circumstances, and our situation is very different from that of the 1990s in Europe. So we have to be creative to come up with creative ideas to find a breakthrough. And as Eric mentioned, we need to be realistic because the economic sanctions haven't been lifted. We cannot ignore that fact. But in one way or another, we have to convince North Korea to come back to the negotiation tables. And that is because our ultimate goal is peace on the Korean Peninsula. And that is why we have invited junior scholars and senior scholars like Professor Thur together to share insights and to incorporate such ideas into policies for the future. In that sense, I think that this session was very meaningful in engaging senior and junior scholars and scholars from home and abroad. Thank you very much, presenters and discussants, for the great presentations and discussions. And I hope to